Today I'm going to touch a live wire. We're going to speak about the Balkans, Yugoslavia to be precise, where we will look at how this new country proclaimed after the Great War struggles with ethnic violence already from its beginning, and how, as so often in the interwar period, some view totalitarianism as the solution. Welcome to Between Two Wars, a chronological summary of the interwar years, covering all facets of life, the uncertainty, hedonism, and euphoria, and ultimately humanity's descent into the darkness of the Second World War. I'm Indy Neidell. This is going to be a two-part episode covering what happens in Yugoslavia between 1918 and 1929. So before you jump to any conclusions, wait until you've seen both episodes. Now, I'm going to talk about issues that continue to impact the region and Europe in 2019. Issues that famously tend to launch bitter and toxic debate. First of all, we're not taking any side here, simply relating what happened. Second of all, should anyone from any side take any toxic debate full of hatred to our comment section, we will remove those comments and revoke your posting privileges permanently. And it doesn't matter how much you feel you are right or are responding to other people's hatred. We will not tolerate it from anyone. You should read our rules of conduct in the pinned post before you start commenting. There you will also find an exposition as to why these are our policies. We read every single comment that we get, and that takes time. So you can do us all a favor and save us and yourself some work by simply not posting anything hateful in the first place. By the end of the 1920s, ethnic rivalry and fundamental constitutional questions have plagued what would eventually be known as Yugoslavia ever since it became a state shortly after the Great War. As the fragile constitutional monarchy crumbles under these conflicts, on January 6, 1929, King Alexander dismisses parliament and becomes the absolute monarch of the Union of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. Alexander's hope, and that of many of his subjects, is that he can put an end to the tribal squabbles between the different southern Slav nations and build a strong state based around a single Yugoslav identity. But let's backtrack a little to see how we end up there in the first place. We saw way back in our 1918 episode on the Rise of Nations that the Great War had created a multitude of new states in Europe. The Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes is one of these. It faces the huge task of incorporating a multitude of ethnicities more or less in conflict. It is not only the national groupings of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, but also the unrecognized groups of Montenegrins, Macedonians, Bosnian Muslims that shall now become one Yugoslavia, literally the land of southern Slavs in Serbo-Croatian. There are also minorities of Albanians, Germans, Hungarians, and many more that need to be considered. The government of the new state is immediately hobbled by heated arguments over ethnic boundaries, identity, and constitutional structure that simply will not abate or be magically solved. Some argue for a strong central state, while others push for a confederation, and ethnic loyalties often take precedence over loyalty to the kingdom. Now, the movement for a united state of the South Slavs has existed for quite some time, but already as an idea, it was burdened with ethnic unbalance. Back in the mid-19th century, certain Croat intellectuals began to propagate the idea that southern Slavs were descended from the Illyrian tribes which populated the Balkans in antiquity. Inspired by the Romanticism of the period, the Illyrians called for a national rebirth through linguistic unity and cultural awakening. At the center of the movement was Ljudevit Gaj, who championed the use of Shtokavian, a dialect used by a great number of both Croats and Serbs, and in 1850, it was chosen as the basis of the Serbo-Croatian language. By the 1860s, this becomes Yugoslavism, calling for unity and autonomy amongst the South Slavs. It's led by a kind of Croatian national awakening, with awareness that for the Croat nation to survive against the forces of Austria, Hungary, and other major regional powers, unity among the South Slavs is needed. One of the proponents of South Slav unity in Austria-Hungary is Stjepan Radic, who forms the Croat People's Peasant Party, HPSS, in 1904. At first, he advocates an autonomous Croatia within Habsburg territory. But as a loftier goal, Radić believes that the national oneness and equality of South Slavs is possible so long as they accept Croatia as a political entity. But Radic's dreams of Croatia's federalized autonomy is to some degree in conflict with Serbia and its Balkan partners. Serbia emerges victorious from the Balkan Wars in 1912 and 1913 with huge territorial gains, which rocket Alexander to fame. He is at this point the crown prince of Serbia and leads the offensive to force the Ottomans out of Kosovo, with national romantic historical connections to the Serbian defeat at Ottoman hands at Kosovo back in 1389. An increasing number of Southern Slav intellectuals, less sympathetic to the Habsburg monarchy than Radić, now see Alexander as a viable vehicle to independence. Radić fears Serbian domination, though, and declares that Serbian expansion certainly could and would end up with only the complete destruction of Croatia and the Croats. And in fact, most of Serbia's ideologues and politicians do envision a union dominated by what they saw as fellow Serbs in Montenegro, Macedonia, Croatia, and beyond. Alexander even sees himself as the liberator of what he believes to be Serbian lands, no matter who lives on them or their religion. Thus, Radić and many Slovene and Croat intellectuals instead come to advocate South Slav unity within the Habsburg Empire. But the Great War is now about to change the destiny of Yugoslavia. In December 1914, the Serbian leadership releases its statement of war aims in the Niš Declaration, where it proclaims the struggle for the liberation and unification of all our brothers, Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes who are still not free. Within the empire, the Yugoslav Committee is formed and claims to speak for all Southern Slavs in Austro-Hungarian lands. So, an increasing number of forces are now driving for similar ideas, but they're also on opposing sides in the war. Another party gets involved in mid-1917 when deputies in the Yugoslav Club in the Austrian parliament call for a South Slav autonomous community in the empire. Fearing being outmaneuvered, the Serbian government and the Yugoslav Committee decide to collaborate, producing the Corfu Declaration in July 1917. The declaration endorses the creation of a kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes ruled by the Serbian Karađorđević dynasty, in other words, King Peter and Crown Prince Alexander. Things are pretty vague and contradictory, though. The Yugoslav Committee, made up largely of Croats and led by Ante Trumbić, desire a federation of unique states, whereas the Serbian government, led by Nikola Pasić, dream of a strongly centralized state. Now, Radić is not part of any of these factions, and fears that the Serbian government are simply using the Corfu Declaration as a cover for territorial expansion. He's not entirely wrong either. Alexander and his politicians are pretty focused on Serbian supremacy, with the commitment to Yugoslavia being more of a military and political practicality rather than ideology, not at all what Radić is striving for. Despite his fears, in 1918, as the Austro-Hungarian Empire collapses, Radić joins the National Council of Slovenes, Croats, and Serbs, which is formed in Zagreb on October 6th, thinking it will further his goals. The National Council, though, announced the goal of unification with Serbia. Radić is opposed, but despite his continual protests, the National Council decides to send a delegation to Serbia to call for unification. On the 1st of December 1918, the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes is proclaimed. Alexander is declared Prince Regent and will become king when his father Peter dies in 1921. The Crown Prince addresses representatives from the National Council with unequivocal support of the Yugoslav project, stating that, "I am convinced that by this act I am fulfilling my duty as ruler, because with this I am merely realizing that which the best sons of our blood, of all three faiths and all three names from both sides of the Danube, the Sava, and the Drina, I proclaim the unification of Serbia with the lands of the independent state of Slovenes, Croats, and Serbs in the unified kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes." A sudden about-face, it would seem, and Radić spares no drama, describing that those rushing into unification are flying like drunken geese into a fog. In March 1919, a provisional parliament meets to draft a new constitution, and immediately hits bumpy ground because of the conflict of centralism versus federalism. Nikola Pasic's radical party considers Serbia's war sacrifice to be what created Yugoslavia, and assumes that Serbian institutions and governance will continue. Sharing their centralist dream is the Democratic Party, led by Ljubomir Davidovic, but who oppose the Radical Party's ill-hidden desire for Serb domination and instead advocate a unitarian kingdom where old dividing lines shall be forgotten. The dominant Slovenian party, the Slovenian People's Party, SLS, is pro-regionalism, but has Italy breathing down its neck after taking chunks of Slovenian territory after the war, and now sees Belgrade as a guarantee of safety. In some ways in opposition to all of them is Radic, who is now leading the Croat Peasant Party, opposed to unification, which has unexpected electoral success in November 1920, propelling Radic to a higher position of influence. Within weeks of electoral success, though, he and the party come to accept federalization within some kind of united state as reality, and republicanism becomes relevant. On top of the main parties, the diverse communities of Slavic Muslims form a number of independent and largely opposed groups. They seek alliances with the main parties in exchange for support of Islamic institutions and a good treatment of Muslim landowners in, for instance, Bosnia. Montenegrins and Macedonians get little special representation as they are viewed as Serbs by Belgrade. Others, like the Internal Macedonian Revolutionary Organization, oppose Yugoslavia altogether and carry out attacks against Serbian officials. Constitutional and identity issues are compounded by economic issues. It's a motley crew of disjointed agrarian economies with more diversity than cooperation. The Northwest is a great deal more prosperous and advanced than the Southeast, and in Bosnia and Herzegovina, Muslim landowners and Serbian peasants are struggling with each other for economic control. To make things worse, the new state has different tax and banking systems, transport and communications networks, and different legal codes, which all have to be linked up. Despite all the differences, on June 28, 1921, exactly 7 years after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and 532 years after the Battle of Kosovo, the Vidovdan Constitution is ratified by 223 of the 285 delegates present at the Constitutional Assembly in Belgrade, though a huge block of 161 Croat and Slovene delegates boycott the vote. The kingdom will be a constitutional, parliamentary, and hereditary monarchy, one nation composed of 3 tribes. It is a victory for centralists. The monarch, still Peter I at this point, is invested with considerable power over parliamentary politics, declared to be head of the military, and has most of the government bureaucracy flowing from him. He has the power to appoint and dismiss prime ministers, and the de facto ability to reject any legislation he doesn't like. The Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes now has a constitution, but it is far from having a stable government, and it will remain that way. In fact, government will come close to failing, or will actually fail, over 20 times during the course of the decade, and no government will ever serve out a full parliamentary mandate. 2 opposing parliamentary blocs now emerge. On one side is the powerful Radical Party, and on the other is the uneasy coalition of the Croat Republican Peasant Party, the Slovene People's Party, the Yugoslav Muslim Organization, Serbian agrarians, and a growing number of Democrats, who all don't really have that much in common apart from their hatred of the radicals. Radic emerges as a leading figure of the opposition and a thorn in the side of the radicals. On July 14, 1923, Bastille Day, he holds a speech comparing the kingdom to the infamous French prison. He is met with death threats, flees to Hungary, and then embarks on a European tour, visiting Vienna, London, and most controversially, Moscow, where he attends the Peasant International Congress. His continued agitation continues to anger the radicals even from abroad. His visit to Moscow is seen as a personal slight by Alexander, now king, who is a staunch anti-communist and victim of a failed communist assassination plot back in 1921. Meanwhile, Yugoslavia is spiraling deeper into crisis. Supported by the king, Pasic forms a minority government in March 1924. Without support in parliament, it falls after only a month. In an attempt to bridge the partisan divide, Alexander gives the mandate to govern to the Democrat leader Davidovich. But he isn't even able to form a government, returning Pasic to power once again in early May. The chaos does not subside as Parliament blocks the government from any meaningful governance, and the government refuses to bow to the reform demands of the federalist opposition. Alexander fears the opposition might gain the upper hand, so he recesses Parliament and refuses to hold elections to avert constitutional reform forces coming to power. The next 2 months see Yugoslavia come extremely close to royal dictatorship. Finally, in July, he asks Davidovich to once again try to form a government. The Democrats managed to form a coalition, which, to the extreme anger of the Radical Party, includes Radic's Croat Republican Peasant Party. Radic returns in August and declares himself ready to participate in government, but still continues to espouse anti-monarchical views in his speeches. Furious, the king demands the resignation of Davidovich. He hands it in, but remains as prime minister because no new government is formed. That might not make sense to you, but that is in fact how it happened. Yugoslavia is now basically without a legislative body, and the king and his political parties are facing a showdown over who controls the country. So there it is, in late 1924, after barely 6 years of existence, the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes looks like it might not survive. And let us be clear here, there are a number of forces in Europe that really wouldn't mind if it fell apart. The Italians are aggressively pursuing their Mediterranean interests in Albania. The newly formed USSR might have abandoned expansionism for now, but is still very much interested in fostering new socialist movements in Eastern Europe. The old Central Powers are pretty much powerless now, but a collapse of Yugoslavia might shine new hope to regain a foothold in the South, at least for economic reasons. When we return in our next episode, we will see how the struggle over Yugoslavia continues and it becomes a matter of personal life or death as Radic and King Alexander move closer and closer to a showdown. Another country that struggled with its identity in the aftermath of World War I was Poland. If you want to learn more about that and how its pre-World War II boundaries were formed, you can click right here for that video. Thanks to Mark Luel Gallart. I hope I'm pronouncing that right, but anyway, thank you, Mark, and the others of you contributing on Patreon. We are able to make this channel in the first place. So please join Mark in the TimeGhost army at timeghost.tv or patreon.com. Do not forget to subscribe, click that bell. Shivali, Nastravi.